Thank you very much indeed. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm sure everyone's delighted that the final session of the day is about the National Referral Mechanism, but we promise to be as entertaining as we possibly can. My name is Emily Death. I'm the CEO of Sophie Hayes Foundation. For anybody that hasn't heard of Sophie Hayes Foundation, we are a small but mighty charity supporting women survivors of modern slavery as they rebuild their independent lives free from re-exploitation. And we're currently working on a research project with the Modern Slavery Policy Evidence Centre and Nottingham Rights Lab, which is about the role of employability and access to employment in preventing re-exploitation. At Sophie Hayes Foundation, I think like many of the other organisations who will be represented here today, we don't work inside of the National Referral Mechanism, but we work very much alongside of it. We are subject to what it does, to perhaps what it doesn't do, but not necessarily able to control what that is. So I'm very much looking forward to talking a bit more about that today. And we have an absolutely brilliant panel here, and I will just give them an opportunity to introduce themselves very briefly.
Thanks, Emily. I'm Debbie Ario. I'm the CEO of Africa, and I'm the chair of the UK BME and the Slavery Network.
Hi, I'm Bea Damara. I'm from the University of Leicester and King's College London.
And I'm Patrick Berland, Senior Project Officer at the UK Country Office of the International Organisation for Migration, working in our Protection and Labour Mobility Unit.
Thank you very much. So the topic that we're looking at today is in light of the government's current efforts to reform the NRM and recognising the links with recent policy initiatives connected to asylum and immigration, what should the UK's identification and support system look like for the next 15 years? We are going to try to talk a bit about how the system is currently working well, perhaps some of the gaps as well and where it can be improved, and definitely somewhat about what the data tells us about where the NRM is at the moment. So each of the panelists is going to have just 2 minutes to give an introductory response to those questions, and I'm going to time it very closely to make sure that we don't run over at the end of the day. So with that, Debbie, could I pass over to you first, please?
Okay. Thanks, Emily. I started Africa in 2001. So for those who might not realize, that was 25 years ago. And so we've been going for 25 years. We predate the National Referral Mechanism. So I saw the NRM come around 2007, 2008, and I still remember what it was like then. Certainly, there's been some positives, I would say. And I'm a very good critic of the government. So if I'm telling you there's some positives, then there are some positives. One positive was, I recall that the NRM was solely for the protection of women. I remember the Poppy Project running the NRM then, for those who were here. We've broadened out. Now we're looking after both males and females. We now have a provider, and I'm not going to mention anybody's name, so a provider who is able to subcontract service delivery, so it's much more broader based, nationwide, across the country. We didn't have that before. And that meant that we were able to support so many people. When I say we, I don't mean myself, I mean, as a sector, we were able to support so many people. There are other gaps, and I think I'll leave those for now, but I think it's important that we don't lose sight that there have been some positives in relation to the NRM. We've been able to look after people from a wide range of countries. I remember in those early days, we were seeing lots of people from countries like Nigeria, Eritrea. We don't see so many Nigerians now, but I believe so many people were supported and helped, even though there were gaps, but certainly we cannot shy away from the numbers in relation to the high number of people that the NRM has been able to look after. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for drawing out some actually great reminders of what was in place before the NRM. Thank you. Bea, over to you next, please.
Thank you. So I'm coming at this from 3 angles, really. I have background in practice with young refugees, also part of the lived experience movement, and now in academia. So my academic work has mainly focused on recovery outcomes and definitions. And I think while identification is really important, what the NRM does is tend to prioritize identification over support and need. So I think we've probably all come across cases where they're not quite meeting the definition. We don't know exactly where it fits, but the risk is very high. And then other cases where maybe the risk is less high, but it more clearly fits the definition. So I think what's needed in the future is a more risk-focused and harm-focused approach that prioritizes based on that rather than identification. And that's also because identification is tricky because it's so broad, right? It's not clearly bounded, the definition of modern slavery. And Laura Brace at the University of Leicester has done a lot of work into interrogating this definition. And that kind of, because it's not clearly bounded, it varies from individual to individual, from organization to organization, what is identified as a modern slavery case and what isn't. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for bringing in some of those definitions. I think we'll come back to those later. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you. I think the history of the NRM is one of significant and increasing availability of comprehensive, detailed data on the referrals being made. But I think in recent years it's increasingly difficult to see where data is driving policy legislation, but is impacting on the NRM. And I think whatever the future of the NRM is to be, it is data, evidence driving those changes need to be at the core of those decisions. And that should be obvious, but I don't think it has been obvious in recent times. In thinking about the history of the NRM as well, is about a recognition that the Home Office has been ever present at the core of decision making. And from the very beginning and to the present day, we've had immigration status, nationality as key criteria for determining who it is who makes a decision, regardless of the exploitation type, regardless of particular important experiences about the circumstances which people have faced. It is the immigration status, it is the nationality which is driving people through the system. And I think whatever the future of the NRM again is to look like, I think opportunities to moving back to at very least a single competent authority would be important, given those challenges and differences that we've seen so far. And the other thing that's changing over the last 10 years is who makes the referrals. So last year, only 4% of NRM referrals were made by an NGO or third sector organization. In 2014, that figure was 18%. So that's been going down and down and down over that period of time. And in contrast, the Home Office had a record number of referrals last year. So they represented 58% of referrals in 2025, a record high for them. So there's a question about who is making referrals, how does that impact or influence the types of people being referred, the quality of the decisions, the quality of the cases, the information, but is crucial to leading to positive decisions, because we know in recent times there's a big difference in terms of the outcomes of decisions based on who made the referral, which historically has not existed. And then finally, I think that the recent history of the NRM, and what we need to think about going into the future, is the number of negative decisions that are being made has increased dramatically since 2023. But at the same time, there hasn't been a huge increase in the numbers of negative decisions being reconsidered. And it's important that everyone has the equal right to have a decision made correctly, made fairly, made objectively, made accurately first time. And if that isn't happening, then people should be guaranteed the opportunity to have that negative decision reconsidered in order to be properly identified and supported.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And I should mention as well, Christine from the Lived Experience group at the MSPEC was due to be here today. Unfortunately, she's not well, but that gives us a bit more time to speak freely. So thank you very much indeed for those opening remarks. So the question asked, what's working well, where can it be improved, and how do we look towards the future? Debbie, you started off by mentioning what life was like before the NRM. Have you seen, or could you give us an example of a way in which the NRM actually does work, or that you have seen it working? It's okay if it's a no.
One of the things I really like, at least the theoretically so, is the idea that when a survivor is rescued, say for example in London, the idea is to disperse them to a different part of the country. And there's a reason for that. The reason is to potentially move them away from their trafficker. And I think in itself, that is a great idea. However, there could also be a few downsides. So for example, if that person has been able to make some contacts, positive contacts, outside their exploitation, then they're being dispersed away to a place where they might not actually know anybody. They might not have any support. I mean, they might have the support of the organization looking after them, but then there are many issues that go with that. So yes, the dispersal is a good idea, but I think we can think about how to improve on it so it doesn't necessarily put the survivor at a disadvantage, make life more difficult for them, for example. In the olden days of the NRM, I remember some young people were sent from London to places like Stockton-on-Tees, which I've never ever been there, it's somewhere up north. And imagine somebody that's been locked up for about 5 years, 10 years in somebody's home as a domestic slavery victim, and then you take them out from that environment and you take them to Stockton-on-Tees where, you know, they might not know anybody. They're possibly the only black person there. I mean, I think that's changed a bit now, but in 2008, that wasn't the case. So I guess on one hand, there's been some positives, but I think we can also make it a lot more effective and beneficial, of course, for the young people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Patrick, you were telling us about the data that sits behind the NRM. Can you give us examples of positives around data collection, or is it really work in progress as far as you're concerned?
I mean, data, there's been, I mean, massive improvements in the quality, availability, consistency of data. I remember the very first data releases are kind of in Word documents, in sort of clunky tables, and they were constantly changing. So there's been a huge improvement. I mean, part of the reason why the data has increased availability so significantly is partly because of, I mean, essentially the UK has had a strong history of making the referrals into the system. The UK had more referrals into its NRM last year than every country in Europe combined. So we are referring many, many people, and that is a testament to the work of organizations who are doing the referrals, who are doing the awareness raising, building the story, building the picture and understanding of the problem. But in terms of, I mean, the big gap from a data side is really is data on perpetrators. We have no understanding about the perpetrators and the relationships to individuals and their traffickers from the data. And I was also struck by other conversations today thinking about the lack of data on actually people exiting the NRM. We have all this information about people, how long they wait, their exploitation time, all these other things, but what happens to people after they leave the NRM is kind of a mystery, and it has been a mystery since 2009. It's almost as if people spend all their energy in thinking about, like, how do we support someone, how do we identify and refer and assist someone during that period of time, and then what happens to them on the other side is somebody else's kind of business. And it is a failure of the kind of long-term protection and support from many angles for that not to be happening. And in that sense about data, we just don't know who's being re-trafficked. We don't know how many people are re-entering the NRM. And anecdotally, we understand that there are many, many people who have encountered the NRM multiple times. And that sort of data is really crucial for understanding prevention on that long-term continuum that we've been hearing about in terms of prevention, not just of trafficking, but re-trafficking.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Let it be noted that we spoke for a good 2 minutes about how well the system is doing before we jump straight into the challenges. So thank you for bringing us to some of the gaps, perhaps some of the shortcomings. B, could you tell us a little bit about what you mentioned more about the frameworks of identification and support, and also if in parallel sectors such as domestic abuse there are other worthwhile or interesting models we could draw on when we're thinking about addressing some of those challenges?
Thank you. So in the domestic abuse system, there's a nationwide phone number that anyone can call, which acts as a kind of gateway to services. So I think something similar to that system might work in this instance, where we're focusing on a broader definition of exploitation, and then there's some kind of gateway, whether that's a phone number, whether that's a referral route, that prioritizes based on risk. Now, in the domestic violence services, they have the DASH assessment, which gives you a risk score. Basically, you go through with a victim or survivor of domestic abuse, and it tells you how high that risk is. And by looking at those results, you can then route them. Is this a high-risk need, or is this, something that can be managed with more advice and minimal support? So I think in terms of modern slavery, looking at sort of broader exploitation, and then at the lower level of exploitation, although it's difficult to compare, I don't want to minimize any kind of exploitation. Having sort of signposting to maybe unions or other services that deal with workers' rights, and then as the risk moves up, having more sort of standardized intervention, like what we see with MARAC boards. We don't have a nationally coherent or consistent approach to safeguarding when it comes to human trafficking and modern slavery. Particularly when it comes to people who can't leave the situation immediately, because at the moment there's very little between rescue and nothing. Some people can't leave straight away. They need time and they need support to be able to move out of their situation. So a sort of earlier approach, I think, is needed to support people in that process.
Yeah, thank you very much for talking us through that kind of process. And Patrick, you also mentioned what happens after the NRM, and drew on the fact that several of the other speakers today have talked about prevention of re-exploitation and re-trafficking happening on a spectrum. That's certainly something that we are seeing coming forward in the research that we're doing at Sophie Hayes Foundation about the prevention of re-exploitation. And that the national referral mechanism can be sometimes quite focused on sort of short-term outputs rather than long-term independence outcomes. And Debbie, in terms of what you see and what happens after the NRM, what do you think the system could do better to deal with that post-NRM period for survivors?
I mean, I think just when people get their, let's say, the leave to remain, and then that's the end of the NRM. I think it's just it's like you've done so much work to support somebody, and then you just drop them in the lurch at the end of it, which it really doesn't make sense. I understand the thinking behind it. Of course, it's all about immigration and people not being able to, people not having recourse to public funds. But it still doesn't make any sense. And I think it's important that we start to think about support as a long-term process rather than short-term. So, they've been through the NRM, they've got their documentation. They should really be further supported to integrate into the system and be able to, move on with their lives. That's not the case currently. So it's either we're looking at a parallel organization or agency to the NRM. It could be a post-NRM organization that can actually properly look after people, give them the skills if they want to go back to school, and so on and so forth. We don't have that currently, and I think that is a huge disservice, to the people. Some people spend about 5-10 years in the NRM before. I mean, the NRM is actually meant to be for is it 30 days, a reflection period? We haven't really talked a lot about that. But, then, and then at the end of it, you just drop people. It doesn't really make any sense. So we're looking for something post-support that will help people to get back on their feet, give them the skills they need, help them into employment and training and so on, and just really help them to build a new life in the UK.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much, and definitely for bringing that point about the timescales and the amount of time that people can wait for decisions within the system. The question also invited us to consider what should an NRM for the next 15 years look like. And I think if we could perhaps address some of these challenges, some of these backlogs, some of these lengthy decision-making periods. Patrick, what would a functioning NRM look like? And also, how might we future-proof it for the next 15 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question which, what does a functioning NRM look like and how should it function? What are the operational indicators of success? Will vary depending on your perspective. And obviously the vision we should be focusing on is from a human rights approach, thinking about the NRM is functioning well when people are well protected, when they're well supported, when they have access to remedy, when they have access to long-term recovery. But historically, the NRM, we're talking about the recovery period and moving from 45 days to 30 days. That was always been a sort of irrelevant point of policy because people were waiting, the year that the government reduced the recovery period from 45 to 30 days, the average waiting time was 670 days. So, and that has to be made first. So it was kind of a pointless, policy change. And I think we're starting to now have to think about the implications of that in terms of the reality of a functioning NRM is shorter recovery times. And a shorter recovery time of 30 days now being a reality. You can see the data on people who are waiting 30 days from a referral to a CEG decision. And the exit move on support is 45 days. So the functioning NRM will look like people having a longer move-on period than they have it as a supportive period, which doesn't seem to make sense from a human rights approach or from an NRM functioning as a protection service. So I think the government at the moment is focusing very much on the reducing of the backlog, and that is the operational success that they're looking for in a functioning NRM. But with greater certainty, of how long it will take for decisions to be made, with fewer people waiting for decisions, that gives us an opportunity to say we need to extend and have a longer recovery period. We have more certainty about how long people expect to be in the system. We can have better move-on plans. We can have a better supported plan. Because if you have someone in your NRM and you don't know if they're going to be there for 100 days or 1,000 days, it's very difficult for you to support them well. So I think a functioning NRM means, without a backlog, can mean longer periods of support, more certainty, reduction of the harms that come from the limbo period, but also gives us opportunity to think more about questions about right to work and the challenges for move-on recovery when people have been waiting, frustrated, not being able to access supported work whilst having casework and assistance. And it's only at the very point when they leave the NRM, which they then have to navigate, a complicated and difficult employment environment. We have a fair work agency. The sort of everything is shifting. So I think a functional NRM those would be the sort of things I would hope to see in the future.
Thank you, and thank you very much for bringing up the topic of right to work, which we often see as an obstacle preventing participants that we work with at Sophie Hayes Foundation from taking that next step. And indeed, those changes that might come through ask questions of service providers like Africa, like Sophie Hayes Foundation, like those organisations in and outside of the NRM to work together. B, you mentioned a little bit about a risk-based system and how that could offer perhaps a different and maybe improved approach. What could that look like in practice?
First of all, public support is needed to put something like this in place. So that's why I speak about a broader definition of exploitation, because the way the narrative is, or the public understanding is that modern slavery is the exception. Generally, when we speak about our work to other people, they've got very sort of stereotyped images of what modern slavery is in their head. But actually, exploitation is not the exception. Every one of us in this room will have some kind of experience of some level of exploitation. And I think if that can be communicated to the public is more likely to be on our side, and that's where the sort of media comes in, the policymakers come in, all of us come in really to work together to communicate this. And once we start thinking about who is affected in a different way, and with that support and hopefully with generating more funding, I would like to see earlier intervention strategies that can support people to exit in a more sort of long-term, gentle way instead of sudden raid and rescue approaches. Also, standardized risk measures that can be used broadly to focus support on those most in need, rather than focusing on a specific definition. It being independent from immigration, data can still be drawn from it. Our international obligations can still be fulfilled in gathering numbers, but kind of from a background approach where in the foreground we focus on safeguarding and support. And as a safeguarding approach, a standardized multi-agency approach, like similar to MARAC, nationwide, that responds to people at the highest risks, especially when they're still trapped in the situation, because that's a real safeguarding gap at the moment. And then also following that, staged support. So it may initially, it may be that some people need just, a small short-term support to recover from the situation if they're not so badly affected. And then other people might need long-term intensive support. And that's going to vary depending on the harm and the risk. And that's what we need to be looking at. And just one more thing I wanted to say on that is we really need to maintain optimism because there's a lot of challenges at the moment. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 years, but survivors are still there advocating for themselves and each other and trying to retain that hope and that optimism. And so we all need to do that as well. This is a time when things are challenging. This is a time where we need to gather our strength, not the opposite.
Thank you. I think that's a very powerful call to action for everybody there to retain optimism. I have just one more question that I'll pose to the panel in just a moment, but then it will be time for anybody here to ask a question that they might like to. So get thinking about that just in the next couple of minutes. And the final question I wanted to ask is, I remember when I first heard about the National Referral Mechanism, I thought, I know what all three of those words individually mean, but what actually is that? How does that relate to modern slavery? And I have heard of survivors and others just talking about the opacity that the terminology National Referral Mechanism gives. What is that? What does that mean? Is that meant to be something I should know about, I should interact with? To what extent do you think that's a challenge? Does the NRM need to be rebranded, and not just for the sake of it, but in order to make it a system which feels more accessible, which perhaps promotes safeguarding more in the way that you described? Debbie, what do you think?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think the name itself, it doesn't do it any service, because when you talk to teachers, even some social workers who work with children and young people, and you talk about the National Referral Mechanism, they have no clue whatsoever what it means. So imagine if it was called something like the National Agency for the Protection of Victims of Trafficking or something like that. You see the word protection, you see victims of trafficking in the name. It tells you exactly what it is, right? So I need to be dealing with those people. I need to be talking to those people. But the NRM needs to be broken down for you so you actually understand what exactly it does. So I think the name itself is a misnomer. It needs to be reviewed. We need something more appropriate for it, moving on, the next 10, 15 years.
Thank you. Patrick, what do you think? Bit of a comms challenge around the name, or does that work well internationally?
I mean, naming is a challenge. I mean, for the Home Office, we've had a single competent authority since 2021, and every guidance since 2021 has said we are working on a new name for the single competent authority. So I'm optimistic to think we can come up with a quick, catchy name anytime soon. But I think some of it is about how you communicate, right? So there's only a certain number of people who are able to access and engage the NRM as first responders, right? And that's part of the problem. We don't have enough first responder organizations. We have fewer NGO first responders now in England and Wales than we did in 2019, which just doesn't seem to make any sense when you think about how many referrals there are. And I think some of it is around just the communication of how you. Because the key thing is, it could be called all sorts of different things, but it's about explaining and describing and discussing what the consequences of the NRM are, what it means, what it does and doesn't do, for people to have the right to kind of legal advice, assistance, to understand the decision for an adult to give their consent into the NRM. Because we see, an increasing number of people who are being referred to the NRM whose exploitation type is not specified or unknown. Like 1 in 8 people last year's exploitation type was not known. And if trafficking is about the purpose of exploitation, that seems strange. But it also seems strange to think that an individual would have a conversation, exploitation type would not be described, and that they would then consent to be referred to a service designed to assist people who've experienced exploitation. And that makes me worry that the NRM is not being well explained and discussed enough to people before they enter it. So I think whatever it's called, I think it's really crucial that people know what it actually does, what it means, what the consequences are.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And B, same question to you. And from the other frameworks that you've drawn on today, any better comms example we could give, maybe?
I think the NRM should still exist, but perhaps as a background data gathering machinery to fulfill our international obligations, and so we can assess the situation of how many people are experiencing this, and then something should overlay it, which is focused on more on support and safeguarding, that may be called support and safeguarding and exploitation, or something that's very clear about what it does.
Yeah.
And I think also I don't disagree with the term modern slavery necessarily. There's a lot of debate on it, and some survivors feel really strongly one way or the other. But one of the downfalls I do think is that it's very hard to self-identify with that term. When you're in a situation of exploitation, sometimes you can see, oh, this is exploitative, but then you wouldn't necessarily think, I'm a slave here. You know, that's a big word to, especially when exploitation makes you feel that it makes you kind of downplay it yourself. It's easier to identify with the term exploitation than modern slavery.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, thank you for drawing in some of those broader and very important but large terminology questions. Okay, I know it's the very end of the day. Has anyone got a very good, very succinct question in them? Yes, okay, wonderful. So we're going to go first to the lady there in the black top, and then we'll go to the gentleman here. 1 sentence questions are very much appreciated. Thank you. And if you would just let us know who you are as well, and if the question's targeted to a particular panelist. Thank you. Thank you very much for drawing on that important topic again. I think I've heard reflected many times how disempowering sometimes the NRM as a system can feel, notwithstanding the important things that it does do. But I think you were also mentioning how being within the NRM or getting a decision within it doesn't necessarily confer anything, convey any kind of status in its own right. Which one of the panelists would like to maybe respond to that? Debbie, do you want to go first? Go for it.
Thanks, Wumi, for that. It's a very important question. Unfortunately, the government's efforts to tackle modern slavery, human trafficking, sits alongside its hostile environment policy. And we can't shy away from that. Until we can separate modern slavery from immigration issues, the things will not change. So, for example, what I would like to see in the NRM is that when somebody is referred into the NRM, within the 45-day period, they get their decision, or at least that initial decision, which is the reasonable grounds decision. It should confer on the person a number of rights. Firstly, the right to culturally appropriate support, trauma-informed care and support, the ability to work if you choose to work or if you're able to work, because you might not have the capacity to work, right? But if you want to and if you have the capacity, you should be able to get some form of employment or volunteering, whatever the case may be. And then when you get your conclusive grounds decision, it should automatically come with some form of leave to remain. You shouldn't have to go through the asylum system. It really is, I've always struggled with the notion that after being identified as a victim of trafficking, then you spend another 5 years waiting for your asylum claim, which maybe is negative, and then you have to appeal. It is extremely dehumanizing. And there's no justification for it. But like I said, it sits alongside the immigration system. It needs to be completely separate from the immigration system. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Patrick, please.
Maybe just one very quick reflection. So, I think people should have the right to work whilst they're in the NRM. I was lucky enough to work on a research project with University of Essex, which was funded by Modern Slavery PEC. And we looked at survivors of modern slavery who'd been in prison. And we spoke to someone who was in support, they were in our NRM receiving assistance. The subsistence rate they were asked to live upon was insufficient, basically to meet their general needs. and they found employment in the irregular economy, and they were found to be working irregularly, and they went to prison. So the consequence, this is a real significant consequence to people, and I think this comes back to the question around empowerment, advocacy, rights. Like, we are disempowering people by not allowing them to have the opportunity to work. We are infantilizing them. We are treating them as victims rather than people who are able, willing, and desiring work. And that shouldn't be something which we, shy away from in terms of saying, well, they're victim of trafficking. They didn't come here for employment opportunities, as some in the media might challenge. So I think people really should have the right to work.
Thank you very much. On a day we've been talking a lot about fair work. That seems a fair request. B, you wanted to come in briefly on this one as well.
Yes, I'll be very quick. Wumi, I completely agree. I think people should have the right to work both in the NRM and the asylum system. I really don't see why that shouldn't happen. I wish it was up to me. And secondly, I don't really understand the process. I do understand that it's for counting processes and for asylum reasons, the conclusive grounds, reasonable grounds decisions. But what other crime does that happen in? If you get your house broken into, do you have to prove that you're a victim in order to get victim support? If you're a victim of domestic violence, do you have to prove that you're a victim to get domestic violence support? No. Why is this an exception?
Thank you. Very good way of framing it. Okay, next question. Great question. Draws a bit on what you were actually just mentioning, I think, B. Who'd like to jump in first? And if I could ask for very brief responses, that would be wonderful, so we can maybe squeeze one more question in. Patrick?
So, I mean, non-criminalisation in the NRM, I guess I approach that from the question of people who've been trafficked to commit forced to commit crimes and the punishment as a consequence, and we have our Section 45 defence. Unfortunately, the current situation is there's a lot of emphasis on the decision making, and many people probably being referred into the NRM, particularly children, in relation to that problem, and many people being referred in by police services or organisations where there may be the intention is to actually disprove that they have been a victim of trafficking, so that Section 45 can be dismissed at a later stage. But I think the court's talked about the competent authority, and are they competent, and what does that mean in terms of determining that? So there's a lot of emphasis on the NRM decision in the criminal justice system, but it isn't well relied upon or well used in that context.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. I mean, the new child criminal exploitation law, which I don't know if it's gone through Parliament now. It hasn't. Well, okay. So it recognizes the notion of criminalization of children who have been forced into county-lines trafficking. But that's something that's being considered. But we're not looking at children from abroad who are being forced to come and, to work on cannabis farms. And I feel that there's, again, at the heart of it is, issues around immigration and all that. So on one hand, for UK children, we're looking at criminalization and saying that, look, this is not right. We need to, ensure that children are not criminalized for what they've been forced to do. We're not actually looking at that within the context of children from abroad who are being trafficked into the UK, at least from my understanding. So I think you're very right. It's something that needs to be looked into.
I think often still criminalization is what's seen first in a lot of cases, particularly in men and women who are exploited who are trafficked into sex work, especially if it's not an immigration issue. They already have immigration status or are British nationals. And if the person has already had a drug addiction, already been engaging in the sex industry willingly, and then becomes controlled by a trafficker, then that often doesn't get recognized as a form of modern slavery, a form of human trafficking. Not only that, it's more often the criminality of the victim is seen, the drug addiction, things that they're forced into doing.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, one final question. In the red top there, you've got your hand up immediately, so it's got to be you. And if it could be as brief as possible, that would be so much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you. Such an important point that we're definitely not going to be able to do full justice to, I'm afraid, in the short time we have left. But would anyone like to just respond quickly on that? And again, I think that's related to what kind of status any of these various decisions in the NRM could potentially confer. Brief response?
No victim or survivor of human trafficking and modern slavery should be in detention, period. There's nothing else to say.
And I mean, and people in detention shouldn't be working for £1 an hour for massive, big companies. I mean, they're being exploited in detention as well, which is a whole other issue.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yes, yeah. And I agree absolutely as well. And I think, well, that wasn't perhaps the most optimistic note to end on, so I'm going to just return to Bee's call to action earlier, which is in spite of the challenges, in spite of some really terrible circumstances that we don't deny, undermine or shy away from at all, there is certainly, I think, today here amongst this group, reasons to return to hope and to maintain optimism and to know that especially with the lived experience that we have heard today and the learnt experience of many in the room, we are able to face the challenges ahead. So thank you all very much indeed.